What have I to ask beside? Can I doubt his tender mercy, who through life has been my guide? Heavenly peace, divinest comfort, here by faith in him to dwell. For I know whate'er befall me, Jesus doeth all things well. For I know whate'er befall me, Jesus doeth all things well.
Good morning. I would encourage you all to open up to the book of Deuteronomy. That's where we're going to begin in just a minute. Book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4. I know there's a lot of chapters in Deuteronomy, so we'll start with 4, move a little bit around in there, and then we'll move quickly to other verses. While you're turning there, allow me a brief moment to express not only my appreciation for your presence, but also to reiterate some of the things that Clint had mentioned. As you notice, especially if you're visiting with us, which as he noticed, I don't see a ton of visitors that are with us. We're in the middle of a construction period right now, and he mentioned not only the Hales and the Crumptons who came by early Friday morning to kind of clean up and do some stuff. I was awake, by the way. I don't know about the rest of these gamers, but I was awake. I want to say thank you to them for cleaning up and taking care of this stuff so we can have this service this morning. Also appreciate Clint for kind of spearheading a lot of the construction. Obviously, he's not going to get up and say thank you to himself, so I will do it for him and say thank you to that for him. Also, with Ken and Cody, I know not only in addition to cleaning, but they've done a lot of things behind the scenes to kind of help with that. So I want to thank all the men that have taken part in that this morning. I want to make a couple of other announcements while we're talking about the construction. The first is, I promised Ken for the last 2 months that I would announce that there's water in that cooler back there. I never have. So if you're thirsty, there's water in that blue cooler back there in the nursery doorway, so make sure if you need it, there's that. Also, you may have noticed the plugs against the wall because of the texturing. Everybody's turning to look at the plugs. They're out right now because of the texturing. And so kids that have, I don't want to say sticky fingers, but kids, make sure that they're not in there reaching in because some of those wires are live. And so we want to make sure that we keep them away from those plugs. Just because of a little bit of safety. We were going to put something on top of that, but it would mess up the texturing, mess up the paint, so we just want to make sure that everybody knows not to have anybody, adults, if you like to touch plugs, please do not touch those plugs because there are also wires there as well. There's a study that came out several years ago from UCLA that did kind of a dual study. It looked at generations of children and what mattered to these generations of children. And they did the first study looking back at 1997. What they did in the study and to determine what matters to children and what priorities they're being taught and what kind of things they're being introduced to, they looked at children's shows. And what they looked at when they saw these children's shows was they developed a list of things that are being taught to children by way of these children's shows. And so, as they looked at the dominant themes within these shows in 1997, they noticed a whole bunch of very kind of what we would call very nice type of principles. Things such as community feeling, benevolence, image, tradition, this kind of self-acceptance. Those were the things that were being taught in children's shows in 1997. They fast forward, this was a study done in 2011, they fast forwarded a decade. And they looked at children's shows that were being taught or being shown in 2007. And they analyzed what principles and what dominant themes were being presented to children in those TV shows. And they noticed something totally different. What they noticed in the shows in 2007 was that the principles that were being taught were things such as fame, achievement, popularity, image, or my personal favorite, financial success. And so depending on what generation you grew up in, I'm sure if you went back to 87 to 77, 67, or even way before TV was even invented, which I can't even imagine that. But if you go back several generations, I would imagine this type of programs would change and what type of principles are being taught. But what it shows you is as today's children are growing up, and I know people that were children in 2007 are now entering college, leaving high school, that type of thing. But it shows the type of principles that are being taught to our children. And the analysts at UCLA went forward to talk about the influence that this has on kids. They said even when parents are an active presence in their children's lives, peers and media go hand in hand. Peers can be more influential than parents even. Teens and tweens, which I don't like that word. I don't know if you do, but I hate that word. Teens and tweens have the ability to talk with their friends 24/7. The ability for an average person to access an audience is new. Technology has given kids pathways to reach an audience as never before, and they're able to use the technology at a young age. Now, this was a quote made about children in 2007. I can only imagine, Facebook was only 3 years old at this point. I can imagine over the last 11, 12 12 years, as technology has only infiltrated our life more with things such as Instagram and Twitter, or whatever it is, all those different things, there are more ways for people to reach kids, more ways for brands to influence with their children, more voices for these people to hear. He made one startling observation at the end of it by saying parents' influence on their children has been diminished because kids are living so much of their lives online. Now, you may agree or you may disagree with that statement. You may look at that statement and say to yourself, well, that's not the case in my household, because in my household, they listen to everything I say, I'm influencing them, they're the ones that are listening to me, they don't have any other influence besides me. And you may be right on that. You may be thinking to yourself, I'm the main influence in my household. And if you are, congratulations. I think that's fantastic. But you can't go without saying that in a lot of people's lives, people are listening to more voices now than ever before. It's not just about what they see on TV. It's not just about what the politicians are saying. It's not just about the magazines or the books they're reading. It's about what they're being fed 24/7. The average person, not just kid, the average person spends 90 minutes every single day on social media. 90 minutes a day. Your kids, your friends, your parents. My mom's on Facebook now. Every single person is being fed information in a very, very passive way. And so the question as a result of all of this, as we look back at this data, as we examine our own kids, as we look at other people's lives, as we examine our relationships, who is the influence on their life? Who is teaching them things? As you look at Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter, or chapter 4 rather, you can see that it should be us. It should be parents. It should be influential father figures. And if you're sitting here this morning, you're saying, well, I don't have any kids yet. I'm an 18-year-old kid, just graduated high school, is about to go play baseball somewhere in Dallas. I don't have a household yet. I went right into Colton when I said that. I don't have a household yet. And these are things that we need to take in principle for future case, or to deal with your grandkids. But Deuteronomy chapter 4, I'm in Lamentations for some reason. But in Deuteronomy chapter 4, starting in verse 9, notice what Moses has to say, speaking to these people as what would eventually be his last address to the nation of Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 4, starting in verse 9, he says, only give heed to yourself. This is him talking to Israel. Only give heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, so that you do not forget the things which your eyes have seen, and they do not depart from your heart all the days of your life. But make them known to your sons and to your grandsons. Verse 10, remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, assemble the people, that I may let them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days of their lives in the earth, and that they may teach their children. The most fundamental influence on your kids' lives or on people who look up to you. And there's a very large group of people that look up to each and every one of us. But the influence that should be directed on children's lives is that of their parents. As you move several chapters later, Deuteronomy chapter 11. Deuteronomy chapter 11, starting in verse 18, he says much the same thing. Deuteronomy chapter 11, starting in verse 18, he says, you shall therefore impress these words of mine on your heart and on your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall teach them to your sons, talking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall write them in the doorposts of your house and in your gates, so that your days and the days of your sons may be multiplied on the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give them, as long as the heavens remain on the earth. We as parents and you as influential individuals, whoever is underneath your charge, you need to be teaching your kids the Bible. Have to. We have to make a deliberate effort every single day to impact people. Because whether you have kids or not, there are people, as we mentioned, that look up to you. People that you're influencing, whether it's co-workers, people that are underneath your charge at work. People are looking towards you. Maybe not necessarily for biblical instruction, but they're certainly looking to you and to me for how to live their lives. And in a world that is incredibly noisy and is getting noisier by the minute, people's voices are being drowned out. People are not being heard anymore because of people. All these different voices that seem to keep bringing in. The question is, ladies and gentlemen, as we go throughout our lives and as we interact with our kids, as we interact with other people, they're going to be fed by somebody. They're going to be influenced by somebody. They're going to be taught by somebody. The question is it going to be you? Communication, I would argue, is the backbone of every relationship. Every relationship that exists on the earth, whether it's parents to sons, whether it's a marriage, whether it's a relationship, which we went, by the way, Joyce, a little bit to a marriage relationship this morning with Howard, didn't we? It was a little awkward for a little bit. But whether you're talking about a marriage relationship, interpersonal relationship, communication is the backbone to all of it. I'm not going to stand here and say that the instance in 1 Corinthians 5 where a man has his father's wife would be totally neutralized if somebody had just talked about it. But I can tell you right now that that impact would have been minimized had somebody walked up to that guy and said, you know what? Not only can you not do that, but we as a church cannot stand for that. That's what has to happen in relationships. We have to communicate with people, we have to talk to people, we have to influence them in some way. What I want to present to you this morning is 3 different conversations, 3 different questions that you need to be having with your family, whether you're the head of a household of 12, whether you're the head of a household of 1. You need to have conversations with your family. And these are not going to be easy conversations. And before you ask, no, these questions are not going to be things like, what do you think about baptism? Those are great questions. Those aren't the ones that I want to address this morning. The first question I want to ask everybody this morning, especially in regards to your children, that's kind of the demographic in view this morning. First question I want to ask you this morning is, are you the only one of your friends that goes to services? Ask that question. And there's not a good or bad answer to this. It's not as if somebody says yes, and all of a sudden they're surrounded by the most ungodly people in the world. That's not the point of this question. What we're trying to discern when we ask this question to our kids is, what is the influence that is around you? What are the people around you that are most directly affecting you? What is their relationship like? I'll be honest, I grew up in a school. I went to 5A schools my entire life. Elementary, middle school, high school. All of them were, at least in my opinion, gigantic. I graduated with 532 people, and I met the person on the left and on the right of me on graduation day. I did not know anybody. Hardly anybody that I graduated with. I had my core group of people. But in the church where I grew up, which was a sizable congregation, 180, 190 people, there were 4 people in that congregation that went to school with me. And you know what? I never saw any of them. Most of them were girls that had their own kind of clique. But I never saw any of them. Walked through the hallways, and it would be weeks before I would see another Christian. Most of the people that I interacted with are the same people that your kids are interacting with, that your friends are interacting with, people that are of the world. I don't mean that in an ungodly sense, but people that are not spiritually minded 24/7. People whose sole goal is maybe not getting to heaven. And so as you address this question with your kids, ask them very openly, are you the only one of your peer group? Are you the only one of your demographic, your friends group, that is actually going to services? Because if so, that not only tells you about the influence that they're receiving, but it tells you about the possibility of their influence on other people. And that can be a good thing. As you look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, we can look at this chapter kind of at length. But as you look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, which would be, unless you count Hebrews as being Paul's last letter, you can count 2 Timothy chapter 4 as being more or less the last type of thing that he would say to anybody. At least that's recorded for us. And in 2 Timothy chapter 4, the first 8 verses, if you read them through real quick, are incredibly powerful. This is where Paul is talking about, I'm being poured out as a drink offering, the time of my departure is at hand, and he's very, 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 very strong. And then you look at verse 9. And you see another side of Paul that reveals a little bit of vulnerability, a little bit of loneliness, if I can say that. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, starting in verse 9, he says, make every effort to come to me soon, for Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me, gone to Thessalonica, Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus has gone to Dalmatia, only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark then and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. But Tychicus I've sent to Ephesus. And when you come, bring the cloak which I left at Troas with Carpus, and the books, especially the parchments. And then he talks about Alexander the coppersmith, who doesn't sound like a very nice guy. He sounds like a big meanie. Verse 14, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Be on guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching. Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 4 rattles off a bunch of names. But the key one is found there right in the middle when he says in verse 11 that only Luke is with me. If you could imagine Paul at this point in his life, who has gone through a ton of stuff. Night and day I was thinking, betrayed by friends who I honestly thought had my best interests at heart. And he's preached to synagogues galore, he's talked to emperors, he's talked to all these different people. And at this point, which would be months before he'd eventually be executed, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11, he says only Luke is with me. As you read on down to the end of this chapter, it only gets more discouraging, because in verse 16 he says, at my first offense no one supported me, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that through me the proclamation might be fully accomplished, and that all the Gentiles might hear, and I was rescued out of the lion's mouth. The Lord, verse 18, will rescue me from every evil deed, and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. It is not wrong as you talk to your kids, as you talk to those people around your church, it is not wrong for them to be the only Christian in their circle. That's not what I'm getting at. It's not wrong for them to be the only person in their circle that is standing up for God, that has any sense of morality. That's not necessarily the point. Because as he mentions here, verses 9 through 18, God is standing with me. And God will grant me the strength to stand up to these other people. And so if in your conversations with your kids, you find out that they are the only ones of their entire group that even fakes being a Christian, even tries being a Christian, at least a little bit. That's a great thing, by the way, if you have people who at least are a Christian in name, they're trying to do the right thing. You may discover that they're the only ones there. The only ones who are godly, the only ones who are trying to be like a Christian. What you can encourage them in that regard is to stand up for God. To encourage them to be the voice of God in what is otherwise a period of darkness. Because as people are going through that time in their life, I'm thinking specifically about late middle school and high school, it's a very transformative time period in their life. And if your child can be the voice of God in those instances, what a world of good that can do. For people that I don't have the ability to reach, that Paul doesn't have the ability to reach, that Ken does not have the ability to reach, but your child does. Make the most of those moments. Psalm 68 is a very powerful psalm. And I love the way that the psalmist at the end of it mentions and describes the nature of God. That's usually what the psalmists do to some level, is describe the nature of God. But as you look at Psalm 68, as he talks about who God is and talks about his own life and relationship to him, I want you to notice how he describes it. Psalm 68, starting in verse 1, he says, "Let God arise and let his enemies be scattered, and let those who hate him flee before him. As smoke is driven away, so drive them away. As wax melts before the fire, let the wicked perish before God. Let the righteous then," verse 3, "be glad. Let them exalt before God. Let them rejoice with gladness. Sing to God. Sing praises to his name. Lift up a song for him who rides through the deserts, whose name is the Lord, and exalt before him." This first 4 verses describe 2 different types of people. People that are wicked. And the psalmist in this instance says, "Let them be destroyed. Let them go away from me." And then he describes the righteous and the song of deliverance. Verses 3 and 4. And I think that's what the psalmist is putting his own self in the category of. But notice how he describes God in verse 5. "A father of the fatherless and a judge for the widows is God in his holy habitation." Verse 6, it's a fantastic verse of highlight or underline. "God makes a home for the lonely, and he leads out the prisoners into prosperity, and only the rebellious dwell in a harsh land." As you talk to your children, what you may discover not only is that they're not only the only ones that are going to services, they're the only ones that you mentioned a second ago that have any resemblance towards godliness. They're the only ones trying to do what's right in a group, in a peer group that is so far opposite God. Doing things they shouldn't at ages they shouldn't even be realizing those things exist. Your child may be the only one that's trying to stand up for God. And what that kid needs to realize in those moments, as Psalm 68 mentions, is that God makes a home for the lonely. God is with them. You need to communicate to your kids. I need to communicate to my kids that a child that is standing up for God is never alone. Even if you're in the middle of 5 even if you're in the middle of 30 of your closest friends, supposedly, who are trying to get you to do something that they know is wrong, they need to realize that they're not alone. Ask them this. This will be a fun question. What's your biggest temptation? I would bet you $1 billion. I'm not a gambler, so this really isn't a gamble. But I would bet you $1 billion. When you ask your kid the question, what's your biggest temptation? They will not tell you. Guarantee you that. My kids are 2. Logan doesn't even tell me what he wants for breakfast, much less what his biggest temptation is. I guarantee you, as you talk to your kids and ask them what their biggest temptation is, they're not going to tell you. But that doesn't mean the conversation has to stop. Because the emphasis in this system is not necessarily what your biggest temptation is, but it's how you as a parent can help them with those temptations. Look at these opportunities when you're talking to your children, not as moments to solve all of their biggest problems, but as a moment to associate with them. And tell them maybe in ways that you feel comfortable doing in your own relationship with them, where you went wrong, where you could have done that, what you struggled with when you were their age, what you still struggle with at your age. How you can sympathize with that. I love what Proverbs chapter 25 teaches. Proverbs chapter 25 mentions very specifically in this passage. Proverbs 25, starting in verse 11. He says, "Like apples of gold and settings of silver is a word spoken in right circumstances. Like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear. If your kid is anything like me and every other kid that's ever walked the face of the earth, when your parents ask you what your biggest temptation is, not only will they walk away, but they will also have the biggest eye roll known to man. There's no way they're telling me this. But as a former child, some of you would say that I'm still a child. That's okay. As a former child can tell you that they're listening to you. Let me tell you that they care about what you tell them. Let me tell you that they are listening to you when you tell them about your own struggles and about your own situations and what you wish you could have done differently. Because they need to hear that. They need to hear that, or else they become adults later who think to themselves that God's never with them, that everybody else doesn't struggle with something, that I'm the only one that's doing something wrong. And your kids need to know that not only were they not perfect, but you're not perfect either, but that moreover there is an opportunity to make things right. The people of Pharisees, or the people of Acts chapter 7 didn't understand. As you fast forward into Acts chapter 7, Stephen is making his monumental stand against the Pharisees, people who are literally holding stones ready to kill him. By the way, stoning is not a very pleasant death. We won't get into it right now, but it is not a good way to die by any stretch of the imagination. And as Stephen reaches the end of this speech, starting in verse 44, this is where he really starts to hit the apex of it. And he says, our fathers had the tabernacle of testimony in the wilderness, just as he who spoke to Moses directed him to make it according to the pattern which he had seen. And notice the phrase that Stephen is using is our fathers, our people, our forefathers, our ancestors. He's putting himself with them as Jews. Having received it, verse 45, in their turn, our fathers brought it in with Joshua upon dispossessing the nations whom God drove out from before our fathers until the time of David. David, verse 46. Then found favor in God's sight, and asked that he might find a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. Notice how he's recanting the history. However, verse 48, the Most High does not dwell in houses made with him, or made by human hands. As the prophet says, heaven is my throne, earth is the footstool of my feet. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what place is there for my repose? Verse 50, was it not my hand which made all these things? There's a reason that Stephen, as he reaches the apex of the sermon, is not discussing the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, but he's describing their blind fascination with the temple. Because as you look at the end of Acts chapter 6, that's exactly what they had testified about him. That Stephen was not only speaking ill about Moses, but that he was speaking about the temple, he's speaking against the law, that he was trying to dismantle the system. And so Stephen, at the apex of his sermon, talks about how God doesn't dwell in temples made with hands. Our forefathers put a lot of thought into it. God never dwelt with temples made with hands. And you, Pharisees, should have known that. You should have solved it. You should have figured that out. Verse 51, he mentions immediately after the temple, talking about the Old Testament prophecy, transitioning swiftly into one of the sharpest rebukes that he would have in this speech. Really, in my opinion, the entire book of Acts. You men who are stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears are always resisting the Holy Spirit. You are doing just as your fathers did. Which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? They killed those who had previously announced the coming of the righteous one, whose betrayers and murderers you have now become. You who received, verse 53, the laws ordained by angels, and yet did not keep it. I'll tell you the monumental failure of the Pharisees as an institution. And you can extend this to the entire Jewish nation. Forefathers, the ancestors, all of them. I'll tell you the monumental problem with them is that when one generation made a tradition and then elevated it to the position of doctrine, the next generation did not question it. They never said at any point, well, why are we doing this type of thing? Why are we washing 1,200 times before we enter the temple? Why are we doing all these different things? Never questioned that. And so in Acts chapter 7, verse 53, as he talks this incredibly pointed rebuke in verses 51 through 53, he says, you people are making the same mistake that your forefathers did. Your forefathers killed Isaiah the prophet. They killed Jeremiah. They killed Abel. They wanted to kill Moses. They wanted to kill everybody else. And now you killed Jesus. Making the exact same mistake that your forefathers did. You're not learning from their mistakes. As parents, we cannot afford for our kids to make the same mistakes that we do. They'll make mistakes, don't get me wrong. Logan's made several. This morning, as a matter of fact, when he dumped his Cheerios all over the floor. Our kids will make mistakes. They won't always be perfect. They won't always do what they should. But it's our responsibility as parents to at least keep them from our mistakes that we know better of. And I guarantee you, no matter how old your kids are, no matter how old your grandkids are, no matter how old the people that look up to you are, they're all entering into periods that are fraught with temptation, fraught with danger, some that you don't know anything about. Some that you know very well. And so as we discuss this question with them and ask them what our biggest temptation is, the point of this question is not to get them to say, well, my biggest temptation is this, this, and this. If you're that 1%, I mean, I'm going to fraction that out a little bit. If you're that 1/2 of 1/2 of 1/2 of 0.1% that actually says that my biggest temptation, roll with it. That is money in the bank. They won't tell you. That doesn't mean that they're not listening to you talk to them. And even if they don't want to hear it, keep talking about it. Because what they need to hear not only is what you dealt with and how you got out of that and how you asked God for forgiveness, but they need to know that their life is better. That they can repent, that they can come home. Like the prodigal son, they can leave the pigsty and come back home if they will but just turn to Him. They need to know that there is repentance as much as it is how to repent. Let me throw a curveball with you. There's a reason this lesson, by the way, is after last week's. What would you have done if you were Jonah? This is a great question to ask. This is a great road trip question too, by the way. If you're ever looking for fodder in those long West Texas car trips, maybe that's just me. Great question to ask is, what would you have done if you were Jonah? And every single one of us, like what we just mentioned with the previous question, would say, well, if I were Jonah, what I would have done is I would have gone on the boat to Tarshish. And maybe if you've got a really shrewd, clever kid, they would say, well, once I was on the boat, I was getting tossed about, I certainly wouldn't announce myself as being the problem of everything, because then he got eaten by a big fish. Not a whale, but a big fish. But your kid may say, well, if this were me, I would handle this a whole bunch different. But let me ask you this question. When your kids are faced with hard choices and decisions to make about whether or not they're going to serve God or whether they're not going to serve God, what decision are you going to make? If you were given the option of either serving Him in a very, very uncomfortable way or taking the easy road out, which way are you going to choose? And this question is a gateway for this. And your kid may come up with a billion different definitions. He may come up with a billion different rationales, a billion different excuses, but they're all barometers for how he handles obedience. I'm not envious of Saul. Because in 1 Chronicles chapter 28, as David is on his way out the door and Solomon is on his way in the door, David is addressing Solomon. And in 1 Chronicles chapter 28, starting in verse 9, he has something very pointed to say to Solomon. In 1 Chronicles chapter 28, starting in verse 9, he says, as for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father and serve Him with a whole heart, with a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts, understands every intent of the thoughts. If you seek Him, He will let you find Him. But if you forsake Him, He will reject you forever. Consider now, verse 10, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be courageous and act. Let me point out two things Solomon is in charge of. Solomon is in charge of the nation of Israel. He is now the king. He's also in charge of building a house for Him. He's in charge of building off the foundation, the framework that David had been laying for the last 10 years of his life. Now I'm going to take all that wood, take all that stone, take all that stuff, and I'm going to build a temple, a house that is fitting, or at least as much as humanly possible. The very name and the very essence of God. I don't envy him at all. Because both of those tasks are nearly impossible, at least by my tiny pea-sized brain, but they represent an enormous amount of responsibility. As you go down to verse 20, it doesn't get any easier, because in verse 20, David says to his son Solomon, be strong and courageous and act. Do not fear nor be dismayed, for the Lord God, my God, is with you. He will not fail you nor forsake you until all the work for the service of the house of the Lord is finished. What David does in verses 20 and 21 of this sentence is, I am going to tell you what to do. You take charge of the nation of Israel, you build the temple of God, but in verses 20 and 21, you need to know David or Solomon, and God is with you. But I love what David does. And David shows a lot of his emotion, not only in Chronicles, but in Samuel, as he discusses his relationship with Absalom. What David does here in 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 20 and 21. Very interesting. He says, God is with you. And then he says, my Lord God is with you. Not two different gods. It's not as if he's saying that Jehovah is with you and then also my little personal God is with you. That's not the point that he's addressing. What he's trying to get Solomon to realize is God is with you, Jehovah, the one that you worship, the one that you're building the temple for, but also the God who has seen me through the lion, or through the lion and the bear that he describes as Saul. And then in front of Goliath, he's seen me with Absalom, he's seen me with all these other things. He will see you through. Solomon needed to hear that. Because as great as this act of obedience was going to be for Solomon to not only build the temple, but to lead Israel, he needed to know that God was going to be with him. An enormous task. Made a little bit easier by the fact that Jehovah plans to be there the whole way. And that God will see them through that. As you discuss Jonah with your kids, you discuss Jonah with other people, the temptation for the conversation to go in the direction of is very simple. Well, it's a very hard command. I wouldn't want to do it. I don't really feel like preaching to Assyria. I don't feel like preaching to Nineveh, but it has to be done. You know what makes that a little bit easier? It's knowing that God's going to be with you the entire way. And so as we talk to our kids and as we tell them about baptism, as we tell them about standing up to temptations, we tell them about praying and reading the Bible and all the things that are involved in being a Christian, they need to realize that God is with them. They need to hear from your mouth that just as God has been with you, so He's going to be with them also. These are some conversations that we need to have for our family, or with our family. Open up your songbooks to song number 674. This is a song that Colton has selected for us to lead as we end this book. As we talk about these conversations that we're supposed to have with our physical family, we can very easily end it there and talk about it in a very physical type of relationship. What I'm supposed to do with my kids, how you treat your grandkids, how you treat your parents, conversations that we need to have with our physical family members. There's nothing wrong with that. That's exactly how I intended this lesson to be, was a physical conversation with physical family members. What about asking your spiritual family members questions? Jason, you don't have to answer this, but how would you feel if I walked up to you and asked you what you would do with your child? Clint, what would you respond with if I walked up to you and asked you what your greatest temptation would be? And what if you asked me this? What type of conversation would take place in that regard? What type of companionship, what type of intimacy would you have with other people that we're supposed to be close with? If we felt vulnerable, if we truly fulfilled Hebrews chapter 10, 24 and 25 by considering how to stir one another up into love and work, and made that a priority. It's only going to become by making ourselves vulnerable, by making ourselves open to other people, and by earnestly desiring to be close with them so that they can help us and we can help them. God desires to help you. God wants to wash you of your sins. God wants you to become a child of His. But the only way that's going to come, the only way that's going to happen, is if we bow the knee to Him and acknowledge that we need Him in the first place, that we have sins and need to be washed. And if our pride keeps that from us, keeps us from things, our pride will also keep us from eternity with Him. That's the last thing He wants. If we can help you with anything you need, won't you come right out to see it?
All the way my Savior leads me. What have I to ask beside? Can I doubt His tender mercy, who through life has been my guide? Heavenly peace, divinest comfort, here by faith in Him to dwell. For I know whate'er befall me, Jesus doeth all things well. For I know whate'er befall me, Jesus doeth all things well.